Welcome back to 3 Innovative TV. I'm your host, Owen McKenzie, and today we're diving into something that keeps every founder up at night, building the wrong product. We've all heard the stories: smart founders, talented teams, plenty of funding, and yet somehow they spend 2 years and millions of dollars building something nobody wants. Today, we're going deep on a specific story, a $2 million mistake that came from good intentions but brutal execution choices. This isn't theoretical. We're walking through exactly what went wrong, where the cracks formed, and what other founders can learn from this failure. To help me unpack this, I'm joined by Jason Walker. Jason is the founder of Lumina, a SaaS startup that raised nearly $2 million and spent 18 months building a platform that never found product-market fit. He lived through the layoffs, the difficult conversations with investors, and ultimately the decision to shut it down. He's here to share the hard-earned lessons that only come from losing everything you've built. This conversation is going to be uncomfortable at times, but if you're building something right now, you need to hear this. Let's get into it.
So I had this idea, and looking back now, it actually seemed brilliant at the time. I had been working at this company for 7 years, running their customer support team, and I saw this massive gap in their workflow. They were using 3 different tools to handle tickets, and nothing talked to each other. It was a mess. Support agents were copying and pasting between systems. Things fell through the cracks constantly. And I thought, I can build something that solves this. A unified help desk platform that integrates all 3 systems. It seemed so obvious. I had the domain expertise. I knew the problem inside and out. I had savings. I figured, how could this fail?
So you had the domain expertise. You understood the problem. You had resources. What happened next?
I quit my job. I was all in. I spent 2 months just mapping out everything these tools did. Every feature, every integration point, every workflow edge case. I had spreadsheets. I had wireframes. I had what I thought was a complete product specification. Then I started building, and here's where things went wrong. I didn't talk to potential customers. I didn't validate whether anyone else had this problem. I just assumed that because my former employer had this issue, other companies must too. I was building in a vacuum. And I was so focused on building the perfect solution that I never stopped to ask if anyone actually needed it.
So you're building without customer validation, but you had the domain expertise. You'd lived this problem. Isn't that a form of validation?
That's what I told myself. I knew this problem. I had experienced it for 7 years. But here's what I missed. My former employer, they had custom processes. They had 7 years of accumulated complexity. Their workflows were weird because their company was weird. The problems I was solving, they were specific to one company's idiosyncratic mess, not a general market problem. And even if other companies had similar issues, every company solves them differently. What drove me crazy at my old job might be someone else's standard operating procedure. I was solving a very specific problem for a very specific context, and assuming it was a universal problem that everyone would pay to solve.
This is such an important point. You had domain expertise, but it was domain expertise in one specific environment. You weren't solving a general market problem. You were solving a custom problem for a custom situation. And this is something I see all the time. People build products based on their personal experience without realizing their experience isn't universal. But what about funding? You raised $2 million. Investors must have validated this somehow, right?
Here's the thing about investors. They invest in people as much as ideas. And I told a compelling story. I had 7 years of experience. I had passion. I had spreadsheets showing the market size. And honestly, I think they got excited about the idea of funding someone who had deep domain expertise. But none of them were support directors. None of them had worked in customer support. They were investing in the pattern of a technical founder solving a clear problem. They weren't investing in whether this was actually a real market need. And I took their money as validation. I thought, these smart people believe in this. It must be real. But that's not what due diligence means.
So you have the money, you have the team, you start building. When did things start to feel wrong?
We built for 6 months before we ever tried to sell anything. And that was my first mistake. I thought if we built something complete and polished, customers would come. So we spent 6 months building. 3 developers, a designer, me working on the business side. We launched. And then crickets. We tried selling. We cold emailed companies. We did ads. We did content marketing. And the few conversations we did get, they all ended the same way. People would say, "This is interesting, but we don't have that exact problem." Or, "We already have tools for this." Or, "We solve this differently." Every conversation revealed that I had built something for a problem that most companies didn't actually have, at least not in the way I had framed it.
So you're getting feedback that the problem doesn't resonate. What did you do?
The wrong thing. I thought the problem was messaging. I thought I just needed to explain it better. So we pivoted. Same product, different marketing. We rebranded. We created new landing pages. We made explainer videos. We spent 3 more months just trying to communicate what we had built. But nothing changed. The fundamental problem was that he had built something based on my assumptions about what the market needed without ever testing those assumptions. And here's the crazy part. I could have learned this in 2 months. Instead of 6 months of building and another 3 months of marketing pivots, I could have just talked to 20 potential customers. I could have learned that the problem wasn't as universal as I thought. I could have learned that companies solve this differently. I could have learned that what seemed like a must-have feature to me was actually a nice-to-have for most people. But I didn't ask. I just assumed.
This is the mistake that costs companies millions, building without validation, assuming without asking. And here's the thing I want to understand. You had $2 million. Why didn't you spend some of that on customer discovery? Why jump straight into building?
Impatience, ego, fear. I wanted to be a founder who ships. I wanted to be building, not researching. I thought customer discovery was something big companies do because they can afford to be slow. I thought as a startup, my advantage was speed. I could just build and iterate. And honestly, I was arrogant. I thought I knew better than the market. I thought my experience gave me insights that others didn't have. And I was afraid of what I might hear if I actually talked to customers. What if they told me this wasn't a real problem? What if they told me there were already good solutions? I didn't want to hear that, so I just kept building. And that fear and ego cost me 18 months and $2 million.
That's incredibly honest. Thank you for sharing that. So when did you finally realize this wasn't working? What was the breaking point?
We were 18 months in. We had burned through half our runway. We had maybe 10 users total. And I remember sitting in a board meeting with my investors, and one of them asked a simple question. He said, "Jason, how many customer conversations have you had this month?" And I said, "Well, we don't really track that, but probably maybe 10 or 15. And he said, "In the last month, have you personally talked to 5 potential customers?" And I realized I hadn't. I hadn't talked to a single customer in weeks. I was managing developers. I was doing marketing. I was doing hiring. I was doing everything except the one thing that mattered, actually understanding what customers needed. That meeting was a wake-up call. I went home that day and realized I've been building for 18 months without really talking to the people I'm building for. That was the moment everything changed.
So what did you do after that meeting? Did you shut down? Did you pivot?
I spent the next week just talking to customers. I set a goal for myself. 30 conversations in 1 week. No agenda, no selling, just listening. And what I heard was humbling but incredibly valuable. Most companies didn't have my specific problem. They had integration challenges, sure, but they weren't looking for a new platform. They were happy enough with their messy existing tools. The companies that did have acute needs, they were solving them in completely different ways than I had expected. But in those conversations, I did start to hear a pattern. A lot of teams mentioned a specific pain point around reporting and analytics. They couldn't get good data out of their support tools, and they were frustrated by it. And I realized that's the real problem, not the integration challenge I had built for, but the analytics and reporting challenge. And the irony is, I could have built that instead. It would have been faster to build, it would have been easier to sell, and it actually was a real market need. But I was so committed to what I had already built that I couldn't see the opportunity right in front of me.
This is such an important lesson. You were committed to the solution, not the problem. You had built something and couldn't see that a different solution might be better. This is called sunk cost fallacy in economics. But for founders, it's personal. You've put your heart and soul into this product. You can't imagine starting over, so you keep pushing even when the market is telling you to change. And this happens all the time. I see it with the startups we work with. They've raised money, they've built something, they're committed to their current product, and even when customer feedback is telling them to pivot, they can't hear it. They've invested too much to change.
Exactly. And the hardest conversation I ever had was with my team. I had to tell them that we were going to shut down what we had built and start over. Some of them had been with me for over a year. They believed in the vision. They had worked so hard, and I had to tell them that vision was wrong. That was devastating. But here's what surprised me. Once I explained everything I had learned from those customer conversations, once I showed them the data, once I was vulnerable about my mistakes, they got it. They were disappointed, sure, but they understood. And the ones who stayed with me, they were even more committed because we were finally building something the market actually wanted. But we had burned through so much runway by then. We had to return a lot of the investment. And I had to go out and raise more money at a much worse valuation. That whole experience was incredibly humbling, but it was also necessary. I had to fail publicly to be able to succeed.
So you pivoted. You built the analytics and reporting solution instead. How did that go?
It went better, not magically better. We still had to find product market fit. We still had to iterate. But this time, we had learned our lesson. We built incrementally. We talked to customers every week. We measured everything. We were willing to change our minds based on what the data told us, and within 6 months, we had our first 50 paying customers. We were profitable within a year. The company is still around today. It's not a unicorn. It's a modest success, but it's real. And the ironic thing is, the analytics and reporting tool we built, it was actually simpler than the original product. We built it in 4 months. The original product, 18 months, and we never launched it properly. So by building the right thing instead of the perfect thing, we actually shipped faster and served customers better.
There's so much in this story that I want our listeners to really absorb. Let me pull out a few key lessons. First, domain expertise is valuable, but it can also be a trap. Your experience is real, but it's also specific. Your problem may not be as universal as you think. Second, investors are not a substitute for customer validation. Their excitement doesn't mean you have product market fit. Third, and this is crucial, you cannot outsource understanding your customer. You, as the founder, need to be talking to customers regularly, not once every 18 months, but every week. And fourth, the hardest thing a founder will ever do is admit that what they've built isn't working. But sometimes you have to kill your darling to save the company.
Absolutely. And here's what I would tell founders today. Before you write a single line of code, talk to 20 potential customers. Not your friends, not people in your industry, not your former colleagues. 20 people who might actually pay for what you're building. Have real conversations. Ask about their problems. Ask about how they solve things now. Ask what frustrates them. And listen. Don't pitch. Just listen. If you do this and you hear the same problem over and over, you might be onto something. If everyone describes a different problem, keep looking. And here's the thing. You might feel like you're delaying progress by talking to customers instead of building. But those conversations will save you so much time and money in the long run. I burned $2 million and 18 months because I skipped this step. Don't be like me. Talk to your customers first. Your future self will thank you.
Jason, this has been incredibly generous of you. Sharing a failure story, this openly takes courage. But I have to ask, looking back now, was this a failure? Or was this part of your journey as a founder?
I look at it as an expensive education. $2 million and 18 months to learn a lesson that most founders never learn. I could have spent 10 years building product after product and never learned what I learned in that one failure. And that lesson has guided everything I've done since. The company I run today, it's successful because I talk to customers every week. We build based on real needs, not assumptions. We iterate quickly. We're not attached to our solutions, we're attached to solving real problems. That failure made me a better founder. It made me smarter. It made me more humble. And honestly, it made me more successful in the long run. So was it painful? Absolutely. Would I wish it hadn't happened? Of course. But do I regret it? Not really. It made me who I am as a founder.
And that's such an important perspective. Failure isn't final. It's data. It's education. It's painful, but it's valuable. If you're a founder listening to this and you're afraid of making mistakes, here's the thing. You're going to make them anyway. The question is whether you'll learn from them quickly enough. Jason went 18 months before realizing her mistake. Can you learn faster than that? Can you validate your assumptions before you commit years of your life? Can you be humble enough to admit when you're wrong? These are the skills that separate successful founders from the ones who run out of runway and opportunity.
One more thing I would say. Sometimes you have to stop and ask yourself, am I building this because it's what the market needs, or am I building this because it's what I know how to build? There's a big difference. We naturally gravitate toward problems we understand and solutions we're confident we can execute. But that's not always where the opportunity is. Sometimes the best opportunities are in areas where you're not the expert. In those cases, you need to partner with people who have the domain expertise you lack, or you need to learn fast, but don't just build what you know because it's comfortable. Build what the market needs, even if that means learning something entirely new. That's a lesson I'm still learning today.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Jason. This has been incredibly valuable for our listeners. I want to highlight a few things before we wrap up. First, domain expertise is great, but it can blind you to what's universal versus specific. Second, investors are not customer validation. Do your own homework. Third, talk to customers early and often. Before you build, while you build, always after you build. And fourth, be willing to admit when you're wrong. It's painful, but it's necessary. If you're a founder who's struggling with product market fit, or you're worried you might be building the wrong thing, or you just want to avoid these mistakes altogether, we can help. At 3 Innovative Inc., we've worked with hundreds of startups and SaaS companies. We've seen the products that succeed and the ones that struggle. We've helped founders avoid these exact mistakes by validating assumptions before they commit to building. We've helped teams pivot when their current product isn't hitting market needs. And we've helped founders who are tired of the hiring hamster wheel and just want a team that ships. If you're dealing with any of these challenges, uncertain product market fit, long development cycles without customer feedback, difficulty scaling your team, visit 3innovative.com today and let's talk about what you're building. Don't burn through $2 million learning a lesson you could learn in 2 months.